Hello and welcome to the 8th session of our series on Government Performance Management System. Today we are going to talk about the origin, evolution, and the current status of government performance management in the United States of America. We have already seen the two films on the origins of the Government Performance Results Act of 1993 and also the National Performance Review. Just let's take a minute to see a few glimpses from both of them. Let's start with the signing of the Government Performance Results Act.
Gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for joining us on this historic occasion. Senator John Glenn and Congressman Bill Clinger could not join us today because of other things on the schedule that could not be changed, but we're very pleased that Congressman John Conyers and Senator Bill Roth are here, the two leaders who have really pushed this bill forward. This is an important milestone, and this legislation, which the President is about to make into law, will be one of the centerpieces of the effort to transform the way government works in our country. This will put us on the road towards something called performance measurement. That sounds like a technical phrase, but it's a very revolutionary change compared to what we do now. We now measure what goes into the budget, not what comes out in the form of services and performance. This will help to change that. It will set up a series of pilot programs and will pave the way for the dramatic series of changes that the President will call upon the country to make this fall when the National Performance Review has been completed. This is the beginning of a new customer service contract with the American people. It builds on some exciting, innovative approaches that a few local governments, a few state governments, and one or two national governments around the world have begun to put into effect. It represents an enormous amount of hard work by Senator Glenn, Senator Roth, Congressman Conyers, Congressman Clinger, Senator Lieberman, Senator Kerry, Senator Dorgan, a whole series of people who have contributed to make this legislation possible. It has been said that a manager does things right and a leader does the right thing. It is now my pleasure to introduce a president who is both, to sign a bill that does both. The President of the United States, Bill Clinton.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, when I took this office with a real determination to engage in what we've come to call reinventing government around here, it was really encouraging to me to see that there were members of the Congress who had been examining these questions for years and seriously trying to address them. I want to say a special word of thanks to Senator Glenn in his absence and to Senator Roth, to my friend Congressman Conyers and Congressman Clinger, and the other members who have worked so hard to try to put us on the road to seriously re-examining how this government works. It is important to restore the confidence of the American people in their government. It is important because to the extent that our government works with greater efficiency and effectiveness and less unnecessary cost, it will strengthen the American economy as well as the bonds of our citizenship. This law holds a lot of promise to do both things. The legislation itself mainly involves the inner workings of government, things that most people don't think about and maybe don't ever want to think about. It requires the formulation of strategic plans, of setting yearly goals and targets for every program, of measuring and reporting how well programs actually perform compared to the targets set for them, and more accountability for achieving results. But we should view this structure in much simpler terms, terms that every American should be able to identify with. The law simply requires that we chart a course for every endeavor that we take the people's money for, see how well we are progressing, tell the public how we are doing, stop the things that don't work, and never stop improving the things that we think are worth investing in. Earlier this year, I met with our staff to discuss this. The Vice President and I were both enthusiastic about this bill, and I am very, very pleased that it has passed so rapidly. I do want to point out that it is, as the Vice President said, an important first step in the efforts to reform the way the federal government operates and relates to the American people. It may seem amazing to say, but like many big organizations, ours is primarily dominated by considerations of input. How much money do you spend on a program? How many people do you have on the staff? What kind of regulations and rules are going to govern it? And much less by output. Does this work? Is it changing people's lives for the better? Can we say, after we take money and put it into a certain endeavor, that it was worth actually having it away from the taxpayers into this endeavor, and their lives are better? These may seem like simple questions, but for decades they haven't been answered in a very satisfactory way. We are determined to do that. I think it's fair to say that most Americans will understand that no organization as large and complex as the national government can be transformed overnight. I also want to say that a lot of the things that this government does, it does pretty well. And there are a lot of dedicated employees out there who do their jobs well. But everyone who has ever spent any time looking at how we do things, how decisions are made, how they tend to pile one on top of the other year in and year out without ever being examined in total or in terms of their effect, would say that this is an effort that is long, long overdue. So I ask, as I sign this bill, for the support of the American people to continue the work of reinventing government and for their careful attention to the report that the Vice President will present to me next month. I ask for the support of the Congress in being willing to re-examine all of our assumptions and to try to take a fresh look at the way we spend the people's money. And I ask for the support of the fine people who work for the federal government to try to find a new spirit of renewal and change that I think will make their jobs more satisfying and I know will help to restore the credibility and confidence of the American people in the public enterprise. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President. Very nice. You bet. Good luck on the program.
Either one of you like to say a word?
No, if I could just make one comment,
Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, I'm so happy that the Government Operations Committee will be playing the kind of role that we will be in this matter. You know the old saw that you don't want to know how sausage and bills are passed. Well, we're adding now, we're going to find out how government works. And when you called us into the White House a few months ago and said, I'm putting the Vice President in charge and we're going to start doing something, and then we're going to pass a law to back it up, I knew that this was business and we're going to get this job done. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, I want to express my thanks to both of you for your strong leadership, your support for this important piece of legislation. When I first introduced it about 3 years ago, 3 years is pretty good, Mr. President, to get a major piece of legislation through. I think two things are important. It shows that Republicans and Democrats can work together in trying to make government more efficient. We all want that. We want better service for the American people, and that's what this is all about. We can talk about efficiency, we can talk about streamlining, but what we're here, Mr. President, for is to provide better service for the American people.
Mr. President, I hope they will forgive me for not acknowledging them each by name, but the members of the committee staffs on the House and Senate side have worked long and hard on this. And may I say that Leon Panetta and Alice Rivlin, who has written for many years and worked on this problem for many years, are among the many in the audience here who have worked hard. There are a lot of specialists with the National Performance Review, our senior policy advisor, David Osborne, Elaine Kmark, Bob Stone, Bob Kaminsky, Billy Hamilton, and others who have worked long and hard on this, and I just wanted to acknowledge some of them and all of them as a group because they've made this happen.
Now let us see the unveiling of the report of the National Performance Review, which was another historic event, and we have seen the full film, but let me take a few shots just to remind you of this great, momentous occasion.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. President, to the distinguished members of the Cabinet, and virtually the entire Cabinet is here, and my thanks to every member of the Cabinet. To all of the agency heads who are here, and the majority of them are here, my thanks. To my wife, Tipper, and other members of my family here, if I may, my father and my brother-in-law. Mr. President, if you want to know why government doesn't work, look behind you. The answer is at least partly on those forklifts. Those forklifts hold copies of budget rules, procurement rules, and the personnel code. The personnel code alone weighs in at over 1,000 pounds. That code and the regulations stacked up there no longer help government work. They hurt it. They hurt it badly, and we recommend getting rid of it. And that's one reason I'm so pleased today to give you the report of our National Performance Review. The report contains hundreds of suggestions just like that one, totaling $108 billion in savings over the next 5 years if these recommendations are enacted. It is inspired by your vision of a government that works for people, cleared of useless bureaucracy and freed of red tape and senseless rules. This report tells us how to cut waste, cut red tape, streamline the bureaucracy, change procurement rules, change the personnel rules, and create a government that works better and costs less. Let me tell you a little bit about what we found. First, some bad news. We found that government really does not work very well in ways that will take a long time to fix. We've accomplished a lot in the last 6 months, but we still have a government that writes 10 pages of regulations on how to make an ashtray. We have a government that for the last 12 years has managed to spend $4 for every $3 that it takes in. That personnel code on those truck lift pallets behind us, we hire 40,000 people just to enforce that personnel code. And let's not forget, much of what is wrong with government doesn't lend itself to amusing anecdotes. It's the kind of unnecessary red tape that
means somebody who calls the IRS with a question gets put on hold forever, or a small business owner has to spend hours and hours filling out a completely useless form, or a division head buys equipment he doesn't need because it's the end of the budget year. It's old-fashioned, outdated government. It's government using a quill pen in the age of word perfect. Is this the way it has to be? Well, the good news is that it doesn't have to be this way. We know that because in our review we looked at organizations that worked well, whether the Saturn plant in my home state of Tennessee or the Air Combat Command in the federal government. These groups succeed because they stick to 4 basic principles. Number 1, cut red tape. Shift from a system based on accountability for following rules to a system where you're accountable for achieving results. Number 2, put the customer first. Listen to them. Change operations to meet their needs. Use market dynamics such as competition to create incentives for success. Number 3, empower employees to get results. You know, we don't have bad workers in the federal government. We have excellent, hardworking, imaginative workers trapped in bad systems. We need to help them get free of those systems. We need to decentralize authority, empowering those on the front lines to make more of their own decisions, but holding them strictly accountable for results. Number 4, cut back to basics. Abandon the obsolete. Eliminate duplication. End special privileges. Anyone who reads this report will see that it is backed up by a solid grounding in the theory of management. It's fleshed out by hundreds of suggestions that go straight to the heart of what's wrong in government. And how does it put things right? Well, Mr. President, let me mention 5 areas that if we can make these changes, will be dramatically changed by this report. First of all, it tells us how to cut wasteful spending. We can get rid of those outdated subsidies, not just for mohair sweaters, but in every area. We'll consolidate departments. We'll get rid of duplicate departments. We'll allow competition to bring about better service at lower cost. Second, it tells us how to streamline the bureaucracy, and we can cut it dramatically. We can downsize government by 12%, reducing the bureaucracy by 252,000 positions. We can also change the structure of government by getting rid of the layer upon layer of management that prevents us from getting things done for the American people. Third, it tells us how to improve customer service. We can set customer service standards equal to the best in business. We can require agencies to survey customer satisfaction and measure performance based on customer satisfaction. Fourth, it tells us how to overhaul federal procurement. We can simplify it, give managers buying authority, streamline the process so they can buy more like businesses buy, and save money in the process. And finally, it tells us how to overhaul the personnel system. We recommend scrapping that 10,000-page personnel code by next September, replacing it with guiding principles. We want managers to be able to hire and to fire, to promote, to reassign, and to reward excellence. Can we do all this right away? No, it's going to take a lot of hard work and a lot of cooperation from Congress. Mr. President, this report is just the beginning, but I'm confident we can do the job. If we make these changes, we can create a government that works better and costs less. We can treat taxpayers like customers. We can provide a quality product. We can hold government employees accountable and reward excellence. The National Performance Review is about change. It will get us moving from red tape to results. It will result in a new customer service contract with the American people, one that demonstrates to taxpayers that their tax dollars will be treated with respect for the hard work that earned them. For too long, government has been an obstacle to change. But if government is powerful enough to block change, then it is powerful enough to bring change. Mr. President, virtually all of the recommendations in this report have come from federal employees themselves. Just as private sector organizations that have gone about this task of reinventing themselves have discovered that the best ideas come from the men and women at the bottom rungs on the ladder, working where the rubber meets the road, we have found exactly the same thing. Federal employees want to help bring about change and want to help bring about a government that works better and costs less. I want to thank, in your presence, Mr. President, our senior staffer on this, Elaine Kmark, who has done an outstanding job, Bob Stone, our project director, our deputy project directors, Billy Hamilton from Texas, and John Sharp, who is a senior advisor who is here today and helped us bring this about, John Kaminsky, Bob Nisley, Carolyn Lukensmeyer. They've all done an outstanding job. David Osborne, a consultant and senior advisor who has been of invaluable assistance to us in this effort. My partner Phil Lader, the M and OMB, who's done such an outstanding job from the very beginning on this, along with my longtime friend, your director of the Office of Management and Budget, Leon Panetta, who's been of invaluable assistance throughout this effort, along with Alice Rivlin, Roger Johnson at GSA, and Chuck Boucher at the General Accounting Office, who along with his staff, has been of invaluable help, Jim King at OPM, and many, many others, Mr. President, not least among them, indeed first among them, the members of your cabinet who have taken to this task with real enthusiasm and dedication, and in the days and weeks ahead, more detailed announcements involving each of them and the tremendous changes they are bringing about on a pioneering basis in their departments will be made. There's a lot of hard work ahead of us, but as we take the first steps, Mr. President, I'm confident that we are well served by this report, one as solid, well-constructed, strong, and able to help us carry the load as those lift trucks behind us there. So, Mr. President, it is my great pleasure to submit this report to you.
Mr. Vice President and members of the Cabinet, distinguished guests, Mrs. Gore, Senator Gore, thank you for coming. To all of you from the federal government and from the private sector who worked on this report, and all of you who care about seeing it implemented, I think we all owe an enormous debt of gratitude to the Vice President for the difficult and thorough work which has been done and for the outstanding product which has been produced. My gratitude is great also to the staff of the National Performance Review and to the employees of the federal government and the people in the private sector who helped us to do this, and to the cabinet members who have supported it. I will say I had the opportunity to read this report in draft over the weekend. I read it very carefully. I read some sections of it more than once. And if the report is any indication of where we're going, then the future looks bright indeed, because this is an oxymoron. This is a government report that's fun to read. It's well written, it's interesting, it's compelling, and it is hopeful. I ran for president because I wanted to get America on the move, and I wanted to pull our country together. And it became quickly apparent to me in the campaign that the feelings I had developed not only as a citizen but as a governor over the previous 12 years were widely shared by others. It's hard for the national government to take a leadership role, even a partnership role, in bringing America together and putting America on the move when people have no confidence in the operations of the government. when they don't believe they get good value for the dollars they give to the government in taxes, when they don't believe that they're being treated like customers, when they don't really feel that they are the bosses in this great democratic enterprise. And so 6 months ago, I asked the Vice President to embark on a risky adventure to see if we could make the government work better and cost less, serve our people better, and to, as important as anything else, rebuild the confidence of the American people in this great public enterprise. Our founders clearly understood that every generation would have to reinvent the government, and they knew that long before the government was nearly as big or cumbersome or bureaucratic or far-reaching as it is today. Thomas Jefferson said, "Laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made and new truths discovered, and manners and opinions change. With the change of circumstances, institutions must advance also to keep pace with the times." That is what the Vice President and this group tried to do, to listen and to learn from people who best understand how to make government work better. This report reflects the practical experiences of federal employees, whose best efforts have too often been smothered in red tape. Business people who have streamlined their own companies, state and local officials who are reinventing government at the grassroots, and concerned citizens who deserve and demand more value for their tax dollars. To meet the challenges of the global economy and to better use new technology, our most successful companies have been through this process, many of them starting more than a decade ago. Eliminating unnecessary layers of management, empowering frontline workers, becoming more responsive to their customers, and seeking constantly to improve the products they make, the services they provide, and the people they employ. Meanwhile, I have seen too little of this happen nationally. I do want to say that there are many reasons for this. Government, as we all know, has too often a monopoly on the money of the American people and on those who have to be its customers. Government also does not have the pressure from time to time to change that the private sector does, so that what we have today, as the Vice President said, is a lot of good people trapped in bad systems. We still have a government that's largely organized on a top-down bureaucratic industrial model when we're in an information age. And very often, it is just easier to keep on doing what you have been doing. I want to say, though, that we not only have the models that the Vice President mentioned, the terrific work done in Texas by Governor Richards and the Comptroller, John Sharp, who's here with us today. The work that I started when I was governor of my state, and we had the first comprehensive statewide quality management program in the country. But also, we have something else to be even more hopeful for, and that is that in spite of all the obstacles, there are stunning examples of federal employees succeeding in this environment. The thing I want to encourage all of you to do is to actually read this report. It's not very long, it is fun to read, and it will reassure you that there are people out here who are making productivity improvements, who are giving you value for dollar, who are trying to save money, and who are proving, most important of all, that we can do this on a sweeping basis all across the government. Make no mistake about this. This is one report that will not gather dust in a warehouse. I will challenge every concerned American to read it. I will discuss it in great detail with the members of the Congress. I will ask people to help us to pass those programs which have to be passed through Congress and to implement those things which must be done by the executive branch. This program makes sense. It's going to work. We're going to do it. There are a lot of places in this program where, in this report, where it says the president should, the president should, the president should. Well, let me tell you something. I've read it, and where it says the president should, the president will. You know, Everybody knows that we've got a big budget deficit. Most of us know we've ironically also got an investment deficit. The two are not unrelated. We don't have enough money to invest in the growth of the economy and the development of our people because we spent too much money on other things and because we have refused to change. The key to remedying both the budget deficit and the investment deficit is to overcome the performance deficit in the federal government, and we intend to make a beginning of that. There's no reason that we can't have a post office where you always get served within 5 minutes of the time you walk up to the counter. Why you can't have an IRS that always gives you the right answer and takes your phone call. Why you can't have a government that pays no more for a hammer or a pair of pliers or, more importantly, for a personal computer than you'd pay at a local commercial outlet. The Vice President and I are going to work with the Cabinet to find ways to make the government more responsive and to implement this report. We're going to rely on the innovations of our leaders in the Cabinet. For example, under Secretary Cisneros' leadership, the Department of Housing and Urban Development is finding new ways to empower citizens, not to expand bureaucracy. The department is determined to eliminate 75 different rules and statutes that make it more difficult to build housing and to redevelop communities, and determined to do more to help people who live in public housing have control over their own destinies instead of being controlled by mindless rules and regulations and decisions made by people an awful long way from where they live. We have other community initiatives that we are supporting for states and cities and towns. Community policing, citizens patrols, and other special programs to keep young people out of trouble. All those things have to spring up from the local level, and there shouldn't be federal rules and regulations getting in the way. States and cities and towns applying for funds for community development and assistance to the homeless will be required now to submit only one application and one report, not the 7 that have been required. Under the Attorney General's leadership, the Justice Department is finding new ways to collect more than $14 billion that delinquent debtors owe the government. Those who are able to pay should. About 20% of the money owed the federal government today is delinquent. It's time we collected on the bills. Under Secretary Bob Reich's leadership, the Labor Department will offer one-stop career service centers to help their customers make better use of the presently bewildering array of 150 different employment and training programs. There is a gripping story in this report of someone who lost their jobs in a company because of global competition, then got hired again by the same company and lost his job a second time because of cutbacks in the defense budget. If the person had quit the first time, they could have gotten job training under the Trade Adjustment Assistance Act, but because they went back to work, which was the right thing to do, and lost their jobs a second time before there was a defense conversion plan in place to train people who lost their jobs, the second time, the same guy couldn't get any job training. I could give you lots of examples of that. We are going to fix that. We're going to put these programs together and recognize that all Americans need job training. The Labor Department ought to provide it instead of providing people to push papers around to figure out how to keep people out of 150 different programs. There ought to be one that all Americans can participate in. Under Secretary Mike Espy's leadership, the Agriculture Department is concentrating on 6 key functions: commodity programs, rural development, nutrition, conservation, food quality, and research. This will allow the Agriculture Department to consolidate from 42 to 30 agencies and cut administrative costs by more than $200 million a year. This just isn't about changing our government. It's about changing our country. We reinvent the government. We are doing something that is essential to reviving our economy, restoring our confidence in government, and therefore permitting us once again to be one American community. Last month, we passed an important milepost when Congress passed the economic plan that will begin to pay down an enormous deficit we inherited, cut wasteful spending, and make investments we need in our people, our jobs, our educational and technological future. In the weeks ahead, we have other challenges to face, from reforming our healthcare system to provide security for every family, to opening new markets for our products and services abroad so that we can start creating jobs again. But to accomplish any of these goals, we have to revolutionize the government itself so that the American people trust the decisions that are made and trust us to do the work that government has to do. The entire agenda of change depends upon our ability to change the way we do our own business with the people's money. That is the only way we can restore the faith of our citizens. An effective government can offer people opportunities they need to take greater responsibilities for their own lives and to rebuild their families, their communities, and our beloved country. We ask the support of Americans from every walk of life, from every party, from every region. The government is broken and we intend to fix it, but we can't do it unless we all understand that this isn't a Democratic goal or a Republican goal. This is an American imperative, and we all need to be a part of it. I look forward to the day when every American can cite some example that he or she has personally experienced in this revolution in the way government works. A program that is paid for not by stopping something worthy or raising new money or increasing the deficit, but by stopping something that didn't need to be done anymore. I look forward to a day when you call the IRS and ask a question and they give you an answer and you know it's the right one. When you ask your children what they think about the government and they can all cite something the government has done to make their lives better and done in a good and efficient way. If that happens, we'll all be in debt for a long time to the Vice President, to the staff, and to all the others who participated in this report. I think they did a great job. Now it's time for the rest of us to do a great job and implement the recommendations so that we can change the way the American people feel about their government and change the role that the government plays in our lives for the better. Thank you very much. God bless you.
So what is common between these two events? The reason I showed you these two films, in both these films, the Vice President Al Gore acknowledges the contribution of Mr. John Kaminsky. And today we are fortunate to have Mr. John Kaminsky with us to talk about the origin, the evolution, and the current status of the government performance management system in the United States. He is currently a senior fellow at the IBM Center for the Business of Government in Washington, D.C. But he has been involved with the system right from the word go. In fact, in 1993, for the first time, the United States government used the term performance. And in fact, it can be called the official birth of government performance management. Before that, they had systems where they called them zero-based budgeting, program budgeting, etc., but never the word performance. It was used in the Government Performance and Results Act of 1993. And Mr. Kaminsky was at that point the Deputy Director for the Reinventing the Government Initiative and also Special Advisor to the Deputy Director for Office of the Management and Budget. So he was at the very center of this movement. And so we're very fortunate to have my good friend John Kaminsky with us to take us through this journey.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to have Mr. John Kaminsky, my very good friend, with me to answer many of the questions to which only he knows the answer. I have no idea. But the best part is that John has been there right from the day the Government Performance Results Act was enacted. We just saw in the film that President Clinton signed that act. And in fact, Vice President mentioned John Kaminsky's name, if you recall, and he saw everything not from just the sidelines, but from center stage. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have John with us. And I'm going to start by asking John, how did we get to this point, to the signing ceremony of the Government Performance Results Act of 1993?
Well, actually, it started in the late 1980s, and this was something that was being promoted by Senator Bill Roth, who was a Republican, and at the time the Senate was controlled by the Republicans, and he had a staffer by the name of John Mercer, who used to be the mayor of Sunnyvale, California, which is now in Silicon Valley. And as mayor, he developed a set of performance measures for the city. And because the city was full of technology and engineers, there was a great acceptance on the city council for using performance measures to manage the city. Well, when he came to become a Senate staffer, he brought that burning vision with him of having the kind of performance management system for the entire federal government. So I was at the time at the Government Accountability Office, and I was assigned to help this staffer bring that vision to life. And I began working with the Office of Management and Budget and with agencies to flesh out the idea, because the idea doesn't work at a national scale that you might be able to do at a micro scale. As the Office of Management and Budget was saying, we don't measure the length of grass in median strips on the highways here at the federal government. We do national defense, and we do big things. So what I wound up doing was my prior assignment at the Government Accountability Office was working with state and local governments. So there was a lot of experimentation already going on in performance measurement across the U.S., but I also began looking at what was going on in other countries. So I wound up visiting the United Kingdom and Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all of which had fascinating performance management initiatives underway at the time. New Zealand was cutting edge, and I brought a lot of these ideas back, and they were used to help frame what was in the law that ultimately was passed. Well, in the early 1990s, when Bill Clinton was elected in 1992, he had committed to reinventing government. And so when he became president in early 1993, he created this initiative. And I was recruited to be on the staff of the initiative and became the deputy director for it. And what happened was that I brought this portfolio of working with Senator Roth, and at that time, the majority had moved from the Republicans to the Democrats. So it was John Glenn, who was the chairman in the Senate at the time, and working with Glenn's staff in crafting what ultimately became the Government Performance and Results Act. And in that process, I was talking to the vice president about the importance of this and how other countries were way ahead of the United States. And he says, well, we can't let that happen. We have to be able to do this in the U.S. So this almost like friendly competition was, well, we need to be able to do something better than New Zealand or Australia or such. And so that was his spark for going to the president to say, we need to be able to do something like this. And so the president pushed the House and the Senate to be able to pass the law, which was signed in August of 1993. And you just saw the video of that initiative. Now, what happened was also while I was visiting these other countries, I found that it wasn't merely performance measurement and management that they were doing. They were looking much broader at the overall system, which was why I was recruited to help work on reinventing government, because it's much broader than just performance. There were a lot of other dimensions to it.
In fact, these are two complementary things. I mean, the Government Performance and Results Act measures the final output of reinventing the government, so to speak, and reinventing the government initiative. And it's a wonderful initiative. But if you can give us some idea as to what was the scope of the reinventing the government, how does it fit in with the GPRA? They were obviously complements, but in what sense they were connected? That would be great.
Well, the Reinventing Government Initiative, which was a much broader umbrella. And so the president and the vice president felt that at the time that there was a deficit of not only finances in the federal government, but a deficit of performance, but also a deficit of trust. And so the Reinventing Government Initiative was to put customers first, the citizens, cut red tape to be able to make the government more efficient, to be able to empower the employees so the employees aren't suffocated internally by the red tape, and then cut back to basics. And so those four notions became the driving principles behind the Reinventing Government Initiative, which was framed as create a government that works better, costs less, and gets results that Americans care about in order to restore trust to government and democracy.
Absolutely, and I've seen some of the reports of, they wrote a report pretty much on every aspect of government, from information technology to every individual department also, and they looked at how could agriculture be better, how could commerce be better, and those reports remained almost a textbook because they could apply to any country, and in fact they're inspirational for many countries. When you see a powerful country like the United States doing self-introspection and coming up with good ideas, other countries can take some consolation that that there is always scope for improvement in any government, however powerful and however strong.
Yeah, well, what we learned was that the government had a set of constraints that weren't something that an individual agency could solve. They were cross-cutting in financial management and acquisition and personnel policy. So we had two sets of teams. One set of teams looked at an agency's initiatives and efforts, but another set of teams looked at cross-cutting things such as personnel and acquisition and technology. And so I was responsible for the cross-cutting teams, and another colleague was responsible for the agency-specific teams. But also the Reinventing Government Initiative was bounded in that we focused on how government works, not what does government do. We felt that what government does is a policy and a value judgment that the Congress and the President and the political realm needed to work out, but the how government works was something that the civil servants who comprised the Reinventing Government team were best suited to address.
So in some sense, you're absolutely right. Reinventing the government is a continuous process. I mean, at every stage, as we saw recently with the Trump administration too, they were reinventing regulation, cutting the bureaucracy. And it's so much reminded us of the meeting at the lawns of the White House that President Clinton and Vice President Gore had, doing a similar exercise many, many years ago. So it's the same. But John, coming back to the Government Performance Results Act, before we move on to the next stage and see what happened to it, if you could just describe for us the brief features, the main features of the Government Performance Results Act, and in particular, the performance agreement. How did they figure in it? As you know, the reason I bring it up is you would have seen that the former Prime Minister of Bhutan was terribly and very inspired by the notion of performance agreement. And in fact, performance agreements also were mentioned in India by the Second Administrative Reform Commission, which led to the reform in India in 2010 when I joined the government. So it's been a great source of inspiration for many countries. So it'd be good to know what exactly was done in that regard.
Okay, well, the Government Performance Results Act had three components. One was to create, at the agency level, strategic plans that would be for a 3 to 5 year period. That was also ultimately, and years later, changed to a 4-year that matched the presidential 4-year term. The second was the agencies had to develop an annual performance plan, or what in the private sector would be an annual operating plan, that when we originally drafted the law, we thought that it would be logical that the operating plan would be something that would be progress against the strategic plan. Well, it turns out that agencies didn't necessarily do that, but years later, when the law was amended in 2010, the link was made. And then the third was at the end of each year to report on the progress against what was committed to in the annual performance plan. And so those were the three elements that were there. Now, the Reinventing Government Initiative went a little bit further than that, and it recommended that they have performance agreements between the major agency heads, and there's 24 major agencies, and the president. And that was something that was inspired by my visit to the UK at the time, where they had performance agreements between agency heads and ministers, not necessarily the prime minister, And so what we wanted to do is experiment with that to see whether that would be something that we could use in the U.S. context. Well, what we found, there was about, I think, about 6 to 8 of the 24 major agency heads that agreed to pilot this. And this was in a period before the Government Performance and Results Act went into full operation. There was a 5-year phase in the law. So during this 5-year period, we asked agency heads if they would do performance agreements with the president. And some agency heads didn't want to do that. They said, well, you know, I don't want to commit to something. And other agency heads, for example, Hazel O'Leary at the Department of Energy, and Robert Reich, who was the Secretary of Labor, and Roger Johnson, who was the head of the General Services Administration, said, yes, we want to do that. And the reason they wanted to do it was that it was their way of having a direct connection with the president without having to talk to the people in the Domestic Policy Council and having to kowtow to what was going on in the Office of Management Budget. And that created a direct link with the president, and they were quarterly reporting back on their progress. And the Office of Management and Budget and the Domestic Policy Council did not like this. They thought that their authority was being undermined by having these agency heads actually talk to the heads of the president, the president, the head of the government. And so over the years, they sort of chipped away at this. And then the other thing that we didn't realize is because our system is the divided branches, the Congress wanted to be involved in writing the performance agreements between the agency head and the president. We said, no, you can't do it. So there were, what we didn't realize is that in a parliamentary system, it was much cleaner to have an agency head have an agreement with their superior than it is in a system like ours, where there's many different multiple centers of power, all of which who felt they needed to be involved in the agreement. So ultimately, it didn't work in our system, but it was a noble experiment. And the agency heads that did it, like Hazel O'Leary, she would take her performance agreement and go to her employees and say, this is what I've committed to the president. You have to help me implement it. So it was a very powerful tool for agency heads as a way of motivating and clearly explaining their priorities to their employees. And so I'm sad that it didn't ultimately stay as part of our system, but it was a wonderful experiment, and it seemed to inspire initiatives elsewhere in the world.
It is. It's a well-kept secret, and after your revelation, people may have a different view. But it seems, John, that a rose is a rose is a rose. Name does not matter. But eventually, the performance plans that you were similar to performance agreements.
Yes.
In fact, somewhat better. I would say they were new and improved version, more institutionalized, more systematic, and they have survived.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, the performance plans are institutional, so it's not a personal link, and it's more between the agency's leadership and the Office of Management and Budget, with some input from the policy councils in the White House. So it's much more of an institutional agreement as opposed to a personal agreement. What was interesting is in the 2010 amendments to GPRA, there was almost in a way of reaching back, in that agencies felt that the comprehensiveness of the agency performance plans diluted it to the point where the agency heads felt like they couldn't articulate priorities that they had. So that's what led to the amendments to the law that created agency priority goals, of 3 to 5 major goals that the agencies would focus on, that the agency head would personally be involved in quarterly reviews on progress. And so in a way that harkens back to what happened in the agency performance agreements, in that there was this personal link of the agency head.
But it will be fair to say that the essence and the spirit of performance agreement stayed, because even though OMB represents the president in some ways, And so it wasn't that the president was doing, but it was in the name of the president. There was an agreement with the agency, and obviously the management, the agency head was responsible for implementing the plan. So in effect, it was a performance agreement, but as you said, a more institutionalized approach, not a personalized approach. So it wasn't a contract with the signature of two individuals, but it was between two institutions, the executive office and the agency, basically. So, and that's why it worked. And so in terms of what was the experience in the 4 years that President Clinton was there, and what happened to it over his tenure?
Well, it was, he had an 8-year tenure.
Yes, 8 years.
And the period in which he was president and the GPRA law had been signed, there was a 5-year phase-in for the law. So the first 5 years was pilots. And the law said that there needed to be a minimum of 10 pilot agencies to test out the development of strategic plans, annual performance plans, etc. But 70 agencies volunteered. So they said, okay, well, we'll take all 70. And so it was started off a lot bigger than it originally had been planned. But the first strategic performance plans weren't completed until I think about 1998, and then the first performance plans were for fiscal year 1999, and then the first performance reports weren't until early year 2000 for the previous year, the fiscal year 1999. So it was a much longer phase-in. And the way I characterize the Clinton performance management frame is that it was creating a supply of performance information. And it was a supply that was at the agency level. And so the Bush administration shifted that focus so that, because the goal is to use performance information. And the Bush administration, when it came in, they analyzed what had preceded them. They felt that the law had been implemented to create a supply, but it did not create a demand for the use of performance information. So they shifted the focus from, instead of agency level, which was so macro, and down to the program level. But the challenge is, how do you define a program? And they basically did that kind of arbitrarily. And so it wasn't good methodology, but they just did so. And what they did is they assessed about 200 programs a year, and they created a scorecard that ranked, it was the law written well, is it being implemented well, and the majority of the score is, could they demonstrate results out of the program? And so there weren't necessarily targets that were being set, but they were creating this framework of how do we measure results. And that led to creating more evaluation capacity in the federal government. And because early on in the Bush administration, most of the programs could not demonstrate results. And so as they began doing this over the period of 5 years during the Bush administration, 200 programs a year, they assessed about 1,000 programs, and they posted the results of their assessments on the internet, so they were publicly available. And so that was a huge shift in what they were doing. Now, the Government Performance Results Act of developing strategic plans and annual continued, so that this was in a way a supplement on top of that. But the goal was, how do we focus more on results, and how do we begin to engage agency leaders in caring about performance? So there was a maturation over that period of time.
That's absolutely fascinating. So John, just to complete that story, and you're right, the GPRA was still in place. It had not been repealed, and in fact, it has never been repealed. It was modernized, and we'll do that when we speak about President Obama, what he did. But here, just to summarize what you're saying, so while the system of strategic plans and the annual operating plans was still in place, on top of that, they put two other mechanisms. One, in fact, I want you to sort of say a little bit more, which is they called it the President's Management Agenda, and they had a scorecard, which you, the colored score, green, red, blue. And then they had the part, which was the more detailed program level assessment rating tool. And
for the 1,000 programs, yeah.
Yes, for performance, and that was very, very program related. But what you were saying about the cross-cutting goals, in a sense, were part of the presidential management agenda, it seems, because those things were broad and they cut across agencies. Well,
sort of. In the Bush administration, what they did is the Reinventing Government Initiative was wide in scope, but had a lot of different small initiatives underway. So it was seen as somewhat like the detractors called it letting 1,000 flowers bloom. And so what the Bush administration is, they went in with a lawnmower and mowed down all the 1,000 flowers and started over. And they created 5 initiatives that they focused on. For example, one was on improving financial, and they were all improving the fundamental mission support elements of government. So the Reinventing Government was beyond mission support, but they focused on mission support. And so it was a financial management and human capital and budget and performance integration. And within that element, that's where the part lived.
Yes.
And another one was around competitive sourcing, which was competing services between the public and the private sector. And the final one was around modernizing technology. So those 5 elements were there were criteria developed for each one of them as to what you would do to become green. Right. And then there was another scorecard of progress. So quarterly, you were assessed on progress, red, gray, yellow, green. And the other one was more of an absolute of did you meet all of the criteria? And so there were 2 scorecards side by side, and they were published publicly. And what was interesting was that because President Bush actually had a master's in business administration. He was the first president with a master's in business administration. He had the scorecard in his desk, and when the secretary came in for their budget, he would pull out, he said, before we talk about your policy and your budget, let's talk about your performance against these elements in the scorecard. So the secretaries knew that they had to produce something on that. And so the scorecard at the beginning of the administration was largely red dots, and then towards the end of the administration was largely green. So they made an enormous amount of progress in developing a robust mission support system for the government. But they didn't focus necessarily on outcomes and the overall President's management agenda. They focused on outcomes in the program assessment rating tool, or the PART, which was used on a 100-point scale to assess each of the 1,000 programs across the government. So it was a very robust, very well thought out, and very consistent approach that was used over the course of the administration.
After Clinton administration, you joined the IBM Center for the Business of Government, which remains my most favorite place in Washington. Right?
And we like you as a visiting fellow.
but more than that, it really is a Disneyland for anyone who's interested in government affairs. I mean, you go there, and I'm still not hit the diminishing returns. It's always increasing. But what I want to focus is, you wrote a recent paper for Mark Holzer's Handbook on Productivity and Performance, and you had an excellent, I think, structure or format which makes looking at various performance initiatives much easier, because you had 4 dimensions you looked across. So I was thinking, before we move further, why don't we look at those 4 dimensions and see what happened with the Clinton administration, their initiative, and then what happened with the Bush, and then we'll move on to the next administration. Okay. So the first question that you had there was, who is put in charge of agency performance management? So what was the difference between Clinton and Bush? It was, who was in charge of the agency performance?
Well, one of the things that I saw when I was visiting other countries while I was at GAO working on the Government Performance and Results Act was in Australia. They had a council of the ministers that were responsible for the performance of the overall performance management of the government. And they had this council, and then underneath the council, they had senior civil servants that helped staff that council. And so what we envisioned, and when we were doing Reinventing Government, it was a 6-month initiative. And we thought that we would be, the 250 of us that were involved in it would be disbanded. And then how would the recommendations be implemented? So what we recommended was the creation of, for each of the major 24 major agencies, a chief operating officer, which would be the deputy administrator or the deputy secretary in the agency. And their portfolio would be management. Up until that time, there was no one in each agency that was charged with the portfolio of being in charge of overall management, and it wasn't just administrative issues, but also related to the delivery of program results. And so this designation of chief operating officers was something that was a Reinventing Government proposal. And we said that all the chief operating officers of the 24 major agencies would gather as the President's Management Council, which was what I was seeing in Australia. So there would be a President's Management Council in the US. So the President's Management Council became the responsible for the implementation of the reform initiatives in Reinventing Government. And they were ultimately also charged with being responsible for helping implement performance. But there was the law did not designate an individual or a position for performance implementation. So in some agencies, strategic planning was done out of the chief operating officer's office, but performance measurement was done out of the chief financial officer's office. And so each agency would configure how they were implementing the GPRA differently. When you move to the Bush administration, they kept that same framework for the first 5 or 6 years. But in year 6 or 7, they said, we really need somebody in the agency whose portfolio it is to focus on performance. And so by a presidential directive, each agency was to create a performance improvement officer position in an office where they would begin being responsible for doing this. And this was across all agencies. So there was some consistency across agencies around doing that. And in the Obama administration, they kept that structure, but the Government Performance Results Modernization Act in 2010 made in statute the authority of the chief operating officer and the position of the performance improvement officer. So they institutionalized it in law in the Obama administration. Okay. And the Trump administration, that has been stable and has been continued in that way.
And let's look at the second one also. And since we haven't come to the Obama administration, let's just compare the Clinton and Bush administrations when it comes to the emphasis and scope of performance management efforts. So what was the difference?
In the Clinton administration, the focus was agency-wide. And so what happened was that all of the agencies developed their strategic plans, performance reports, and posted it on their own websites. In the Bush administration, they created a single website, and this is toward the end of the administration, single website where they posted all the agency performance plans, reports, etc., in one location. And that was a website called results.gov. That doesn't exist any longer. And then in the Obama administration, they put that into law, and it was called performance.gov, which still exists today. And so every agency's strategic plan, performance report, and then the addition of agency priority goals is posted on this performance.gov website. So you can go to one place and see everything that's going on across the federal government, and it's really pretty amazing. And the Trump administration has brought in the U.S. Digital Service to make it really user-friendly, and it's really now much, much better, much more conducive to people using the information.
John, what about the other dimension that you mentioned in your paper, and you compare all four administrations, is the unit of analysis?
Ah, okay.
Unit of analysis.
What the way I characterize it is, in the Clinton administration, the unit of analysis for performance was the agency. And so in the Department of Defense, you have 1.5 million military and about 800,000 civilians, and to analyze that as one whole with the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, and Marines, it sort of becomes superficial. And so that was sort of different. And then when you move to the Bush administration, they shifted the unit of analysis to programs. And with 1,000 programs, you had much more granular performance information about what was going on in an agency. But when you move to the Obama administration, there was a sense that 1,000 things was way too many. And they were only assessed, because of the scale, they were only assessed once every 3 or 4 years. So that wasn't as helpful. So what they did is they said, let's focus on 3 to 5, what they called agency priority goals within each agency. And across the government, in the Obama administration, that was about 100 initiatives, which 100 is a whole lot easier to keep track of than 1,000. And the law also in the 2010 Modernization Act required that the agencies review the progress against those goals on a quarterly basis and post that, and that is now posted on performance.gov. So quarterly, you have progress reports against the goals that were set by the agencies. In addition, the Obama administration said, we need to have some cross-agency priority goals as well. And so the law says there's 2 kinds of cross-agency priority goals. One that is mission support related, so improving financial management or improving technology across the government. But the other was things that were programmatic, that that affected outcomes that American citizens would notice. So for example, the priority goal today is modernizing information technology, and that involves reducing the number of data centers and stuff like that. So that's a technology-related cross-agency priority, and a mission-related priority goal is streamlining the permitting process to approve large-scale infrastructure projects. And that involves bringing together people from about 16 different agencies to work together, so that a contractor that's trying to build a major bridge doesn't have to go to 16 agencies. He or she just goes to one place to deal with the permitting. So those are the cross-agency priority goals that were created as part of the Modernization Act. And that rolled over to the Trump administration. The Trump administration has institutionalized that, and they're using the cross-agency priority goals, and they've established 14 of them, and they have said those comprise our president's management agenda. So in the Bush administration, the president's management agenda was broader than just performance, and in the Trump administration, it's come down to that is what we do for government management.
And then while we are at it, let's look at your 4th dimension that you had in that paper, and you looked across the systems and you looked at who are the intended users of the performance management information that was being produced. So starting with...
The vision that we had when we drafted the Government Performance Results Act was that this would be information that Congress would find useful in appropriating monies and in improving the performance of agencies. So that was the vision. What we found is that Congress didn't find that information helpful. They initially and this was when the House was in Republican hands, they really focused on the very first strategic plans of agencies. And in fact, Newt Gingrich, who was the chair, or the head of the House at the time, the Speaker, he created special task forces because in our government, the agency's structure and the congressional committee structure are not the same. So, for example, our Environmental Protection Agency is actually overseen by about a dozen different congressional committees. So when the Environmental Protection Agency has a strategic plan, who do they go to be able to consult? And so what the Speaker did is he created a special committee that brought together these dozen committees to have a unified look at the agency's strategic plan. That was the only time that was ever done, but it was a very thoughtful, but it's something that wasn't sustained.
Who were the intended users of this information system in the Bush administration?
Yeah, and in the Bush administration, again, they were hoping that this would be useful to inform budget allocations. And so in a way, the intended user was the Congress, but it was really OMB that was the primary user in using it. And they posted it on a website, but it turns out that Congress was unwilling to believe the ratings. They felt that the ratings were politically driven. And if you were on the inside of government, that wasn't the case, but that was how it was perceived. So they were less likely to use the information. So again, Congress was the intended audience, but they didn't use it. And the public, for accountability, it was too much for them to focus on. And then if you move to the Obama administration, what they began doing was focusing on these agency priority goals. And so, in a way, in many respects, the audience was inside the government. And so it was agencies being able to share, especially on the cross-agency priority goals, is what is agriculture doing to improve technology, or what is defense doing, or what is education doing. So it became a communication mechanism inside government to share progress and what's going on, which is also the case in the Trump administration. But what's really interesting is because the website is so much better, it's actually beginning to, for the first time, attract some academics and others and looking at this. What my vision is that they will begin to take these elements. For example, if one of the cross-agency priority goals at one of the agency priority goals at one time in the Department of Agriculture was reducing the number of food deserts, which is people living more than 1 or 2 miles away from the nearest grocery stores. How do you bring groceries closer to poor people? And if you could tie that particular performance element to an advocacy group that cares about that, so that there's a much stronger link between the government's goals and the people who advocate for them, that would be a way of doing it. And what I've envisioned is some sort of like plug-in for nonprofits or advocacy groups of the 100 different agency priority, so that they could customize it to their interest, because they are not interested in all 100. They're only interested in their one thing. So this is a way to try to do that, and that may be the next step in the next administration, is to begin customizing the information so others can readily use it.
So John, you have already mentioned a few times the GPRA Modernization Act during Obama administration. So let's move now to Obama administration, and then let's talk about why was it modernized and what does modernization mean?
Well, there were two elements to it. The Government Accountability Office, over the years, had studied the implementation of the Government Performance and Results Act and identified areas where it could be improved. So, for example, when we drafted the law, we thought that the strategic plans should not be politicized and should be separate from a presidential term. And so we said that the agencies could create strategic plans that would be 3 to 5 years in length. And so agencies chose whatever length that they felt was appropriate for them. Well, at the beginning of the Bush administration, the Secretary of Education said, we have a major priority law. It's called No Child Left Behind. It's not mentioned in the strategic plan that I've inherited. I'm going to ignore the strategic plan. And so what we learned is that you had to tie the strategic plan to the presidential administration. So the GPRA Modernization Act changed that from 3 to 5 years to 4 years, coterminous with presidential terms. So there were lessons learned like that. And then the creation of chief operating officers and performance improvement officers. So it created a governance structure for it. The other thing was that there were strong push to put the program assessment rating tool from OMB into law. And the Obama administration says, no, we know that that's overload. Nobody pays attention to it. So what they did is they embedded instead the agency priority goals and the cross-agency priority goals. And the thing about the cross-agency priority goals that I was fascinated about was when I went from the Government Accountability Office to the White House to work on reinventing government, I did not realize that there was no legal basis to work across agency boundaries that existed. You could have one agency run an initiative and other agencies could participate, but if there was a joint initiative, there was no legal basis. So the cross-agency priority goals creates a legal basis to work across agency boundaries, designate a cross-agency priority goal leader, and to be able to fund it. And so that was, to me, a major step forward in being able to work collaboratively across agency boundaries. And so so those were some of the major things that happened in the Modernization Act, was taking lessons learned of what had not worked, or things that were piloted that, like performance improvement officers, and embedded them in the law, and then also the cross-agency and the agency priority goal structures.
I think I found it very interesting, in fact, somewhat surprising, but definitely very interesting, your description of what happened under Trump administration, which is pretty much the same thing continued. There's no disruption in government performance management, it seems. Less everything has continued.
Well, one of the visions of the career staff in the Office of Management and Budget, instead of changing the performance system every president, is to have a consistent performance system, much like you have a consistent budget system, and you just use it for your priorities rather than trying to rebuild. And so the career staff in the Office of Management and Budget was very supportive of the Modernization Act because it created a certain level of stability. And then the leadership, the career leadership there, did two other things that were to support the law, but weren't necessarily in the law. One was that they got Congress to create a small fund to help provide seed money for the cross-agency priority goals, so they could establish a separate staff that would support cross-agency initiatives. And the other thing they did was, because the framework was around specific agency priority goals and cross-agency, is that it didn't look at what was going on across the agency. So they created administratively something called the Strategic Objective Review. So in the agency strategic plans, you have strategic goals, and then below the strategic goals are strategic objectives. And in the U.S. government, it turns out there's about 300 strategic objectives, and that became the new unit of analysis. So what the vision is long-term is that the strategic objective would then be, you would budget around that basket of programs that are trying to achieve a certain kind of objective that the government is trying to achieve. And we're not there yet. Right now, the strategic objective reviews are conducted annually between OMB and the agency head, department by department. And so some agencies have like 2, some agencies have 5 or 6. And those assessments then are rated as where they're making progress, where they need additional attention and resources, etc. So that's used to inform the budget process. It doesn't drive it, but it informs. It's done in the spring, and the budget process is done in the fall. So that foundation of what are the things that we need to consider for the budget process are put into place. So it's become a very strong foundation for performance management across the government that informs, it doesn't drive the budget process, but informs the budget decisions.
John, what about the incentive part of it? I mean, what drives people to pay attention to this? Does it matter did it matter in the Clinton administration, Bush administration, if you did well or you didn't do well, and how did they come to that conclusion? And also in the US government, you have Office of Personnel Management. So what was the connection between performance management and personnel management, if any?
Yeah. Well, in the Clinton administration, I'm still constructing the performance supply of information. So there wasn't as much of an effort to connect then. In the Bush administration, the connection was very, very high level with a scorecard. And so the president held the agency head accountable. The agency head then went to his or her staffs and held them accountable for that. And then that cascaded down from the political staffs to the career staff. And so those elements of the president's management agenda were embedded into individual performance agreements for career executives. Not necessarily for political executives, but they were career executives. In the Obama administration, the elements in the priority goals became embedded into the performance agreements. And the Government Accountability Office, every 3 years, surveys federal managers as to whether they're using performance information to manage. And the results have been kind of discouraging. Ever since the Clinton administration, it was about 30%. And the numbers didn't actually increase much. But those that were working on priority goals felt that they were using performance information the most. So this notion of performance goals and tying it to the individual's performance agreements began to link. Now, the Bush administration did try to change the law to become much more pay for performance, but that system collapsed, and it wasn't necessarily tied to the performance management system.
In terms of communication, I mean, I've noticed in my time in Washington that there's a huge amount of training going on, seminars, workshop, everyone seems to be informed, and you're part of many of them. So how does the government communicate within the government and to outsiders? Do outsiders really know that this is happening? Performance management, which seems to be such a well-organized effort in the government, one of the few well-organized, as you said, it's almost like the budget. I mean, it's reaching that level. It may not have reached, but it's getting to that point. It's the GPRA has been since 1993, has been affecting the government. So that's a lot of stability. So how does the government communicate the results, its aspirations regarding performance within the government and outside the government?
Not very well. And it's not from a lack of trying. In the Clinton administration, there was the effort to go brief the Congress on what was going on with performance, but the Congress, they didn't care. Unless it was tied to a policy initiative, that wasn't not a priority for them. There were some studies by the Congressional Research Service that showed that performance information was not being used in the budget decision-making process, which was discouraging. In the Bush administration, the scorecard that they created was communicated widely within the upper ranks. So it was something that did not reach the field staff because they weren't involved in improving financial management. They were involved in running the parks or processing patents or delivering Social Security benefits. So in a way, the Bush administration's initiatives on the president's management agenda didn't affect the frontline workers in most agencies. The program assessment rating tool, sort of, but that was only done episodically. The Obama administration's more targeted agency priority goals did reach down to field staff and did engage them, but these were on fairly narrow topics. So, for example, there was a priority goal between our Department of Housing and Urban Development and our Department of Veterans Affairs to reduce the number of homeless veterans. That was something that was run out of the field. They were actively engaged, but that was a fairly small slice of either of those departments' major initiatives. And in the Trump administration, the other thing that was interesting also is that I found that the Office of Management and Budget tended to not invest time in communicating this stuff, that they felt that their customer was the president, it wasn't the public. The Trump administration was the first one where the deputy director for management of the Office of Management and Budget created a Twitter account and for the performance.gov and for herself, and tweeted on a regular basis the performance of each of the agency priority goals and stuff. So there is, for the first time, social media around the what's the progress, and they link back to performance.gov so people can get more detailed data. So that's out there, but it's still in the formative stage of, it's not like more than maybe a couple thousand people are actually following it, but as long as key people are following it, that's what matters. So this notion of communicating progress typically is left to the agencies, and the agencies tend to focus on their current policy initiatives, not their performance. So this is still a struggle for communications externally. Internally, this is sort of happens, but it focuses more on the priority goals and not more broadly.
John, last two questions. One, I want to ask about the Government Accountability Office, GAO, which is like your Comptroller and Auditor General, basically, right? Yeah. And what is the role they play in government performance management? Because I think there is some scrutiny of these performance plans, etc., by GAO. They come up with these reports. So what is the exact connection? Because and you may want to comment on it, but in my understanding of the system, GAO is genuinely an independent sort of an organization. But you may want to comment on that, because in the Commonwealth countries we have Controller and Auditor General, who is a constitutional body, and in fact, it's at par with the Supreme Court judges or something.
Well, in the U.S., the Government Accountability Office is an agency that is part of the Congress, the legislative branch, as opposed to the executive branch. That creates some independence, and the head of that agency is appointed for a 15-year non-renewable term. So there's that level of independence there. There's a staff of about 3,500 people, and Congress will mandate what kinds of studies that they will do. Sometimes they can do independent work, but typically it's something that is directed by the Congress. The executive branch cannot direct them to do anything. So under the Government Performance and Results Act, there was a provision in the original law and in the 2010 amendments that GAOs study the implementation of the law. So they don't go back and do comprehensive reviews each year of agency performance plans or something like that. That's left up to the agency and inspector generals. But GAO has been looking at the implementation of the law both in '93 and in 2010. And I think that in the 2010 law, they were mandated to produce reports annually, at least, for a five or 6 year period or something like that. But they still have a unit that looks at the implementation of performance issues. What they've done in recent years is that there are new laws beyond the Government Performance Results Act. The most recent one is the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking, which ties back to the GPRA, and they're looking at the implementation of that right now.
John, finally, one of the most interesting and fascinating things that I find each time I visit the IBM Center for the Business of Government, and each time you send me an invitation to join one of the meetings, are these meetings on topics which are on the, I would say, frontier topics. For instance, artificial intelligence in government. There was this thing that you organized on foresight in government. There was, and similarly, there are many other. So I like if you can just comment on some of these avant-garde sort of initiatives which are on the cutting edge in the government, and I know you're involved with all of them. Just a brief introduction to our colleagues who may be watching.
Sure. Well, the IBM Center for the Business of Government tries to bridge between academia and practitioners in government. And so what we do is that we have a competitive grant system to academics and nonprofits to produce reports on cutting edge topics for government managers. And so what we'll do is we will develop an agenda of what we think are going to be cutting edge topics facing public managers over the next 3 to 5 years. And we engage public managers in helping identify those topics. And so, for example, we have a thread of work currently around the use of artificial intelligence in agencies. We have a report that's coming out in a couple of weeks that look at how do you use artificial intelligence to reduce the bias that individuals may have in making decisions. So it can be used in that way. We have a report that's coming out on how do you begin sharing data between federal, state, and local governments. And the report is full of examples of how states and localities and federal government are actually sharing data, for example, COVID data between federal, state, and local levels. And it has recommendations in it to agencies as to how they can improve their operations. We'll also do things, for example, we did a study earlier this year on how the workplace is changing as a result of the use of telework and distant work as a result of COVID, and how these changes may actually be embedded and institutionalized in government agencies. Because, for example, instead of having in-person appeals hearings for benefits, you can do this through a televised thing through Zoom or something like that. So what we try to do is not come up with ideas that nobody's ever thought of, but highlight those small pockets of innovation that could then be scaled or inspire things across other levels of government or even internationally.
Can you give a short description of the agile government thing that I know Dan and you are working on?
IBM Center has been working with the National Academy for Public Administration to create a center that is what we call the Agile Government Center.
Yeah.
And we have been looking at taking the principles of agile software development in the technology space and applying them to government management. And Ed DeSev, who was a former deputy director for management under Bill Clinton, is leading this initiative as just a volunteer. And through the National Academy and the IBM Center, this has become an international approach to taking agile principles and applying them to government improvement. And so what they're doing is they're capturing case studies of how agile principles are being used to implement government initiatives around the world. And right now, they meet almost like every month or every other month, and there's about like 80 or 90 people from around the world that are involved in this, and the OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, is involved in this as well.
Thank you, John, and thank you for reminding me the difference between the Commonwealth and the American English, agile versus agile. On the other side of the pond is the same. Thank you so much, John. It's fascinating. I could go on. I know that you have many other things to do, but you are a source, and I am a beneficiary of all the wisdom that you have. And thank you. Maybe we will have you come and answer some of the questions that people might have after listening to you, and that would be fascinating. But for now,
Well,
yeah.
Well, I'm very honored that you invited me to participate in your series, and the work that you're doing, I think, is going to have a long-term impact. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much. All the best.